Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the nominees for joining us today. This week, President Biden signed into law the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I was proud to work with Senator Portman, the White House, Chair Cantwell, and many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass a historic law that includes our boldest investment ever in closing the digital divide. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law invests $65 billion in broadband deployment, affordability for low-income families, digital inclusion, and specific programs for broadband expansion in rural and tribal areas. The Federal Communications Commission has an important role to implement and oversee the IIJA, and Arizonans expect the law to be implemented in a fair and expedient manner to benefit our communities. So my first question is for Chair Rosenzwersel. I've appreciated your work to improve connectivity in Arizona, particularly for telehealth, for students learning remotely during the pandemic, and for tribal communities. Our bipartisan infrastructure law provides a significant investment in broadband deployment, with Arizona set to receive hundreds of millions of dollars to expand access to broadband internet. This is crucial for Arizonans living in rural and tribal areas. But in order to allocate these broadband investments, the FCC needs to finally update its broadband maps to determine which areas of the country do not have access to high-speed broadband. So could you provide an update on the FCC's mapping process and tell us when these maps will be complete?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. The Broadband Data Act was passed into law in 2020. When I took over at the agency, the first thing we did was set up a broadband data task force. We procured computer processing power so that we could actually take in all this data and start manipulating it for updated maps. We set up a system to make sure that we have a statistically valid way for states like Arizona, towns in Arizona, and consumers to actually challenge any of the data that our carriers provide us with. And right now we're working to finally procure and resolve a broadband serviceable location fabric, which will feature every buildable location in the United States. That is part of an ongoing government contracting project that we are working very fast to finish. And as soon as we finish that, we are going to proceed with new data, which will form new maps. My goal is to make that all available to the NTIA and others who have broadband authority as a result of this infrastructure legislation, because I know that that data is absolutely vital for them to make smart choices with the new funding they have from that bill.
Thank you, Chair Rosenworcel. Given your experience on the FCC working to expand broadband and close the digital divide, what other advice do you have for states as they distribute the broadband funding that they'll receive through this bipartisan bill?
You know, this is a terrific question. I appreciate that you're asking. First, I would encourage them to even come talk to us. We can tell them about what data and information we have. I'm going to encourage them also to think creatively about the different entities that might be able to apply for these funds, which would include some non-traditional actors like rural electric co-ops. And then they're going to have to think beyond just the last mile and look at middle mile and other activities that can increase redundancy and competition in the state.
Turning to Mr. Bedoya, Arizonans value their privacy, and they don't want their data used for malicious purposes. They don't want their data breached. And since 2005, data breaches have cost Arizonans over $1 billion. You know, Arizonans also want Congress to work together to develop bipartisan solutions to major issues. And there are reports that the Federal Trade Commission is considering opening a rulemaking for data privacy, where the commission would act without Congress passing new legislation to set federal privacy policy. If you're confirmed as a commissioner, would you support such an approach, and why or why not?
Senator, I would support a rulemaking on unfair methods and deceptive practices. And if it extended to data security, I would emphatically hope, if confirmed, to work with you and your staff to make sure that your concerns are addressed. But I do agree that it is preferable for Congress to pass a law. Unfortunately, if that doesn't happen, I want to make sure that your constituents and everyone else in the country is protected. But I very much would like to work with you on this question. I know you're a leader on it, particularly with respect to seniors.
I'm turning back to Chair Rosenworcel. Prior to this hearing, the committee approved bipartisan legislation that I developed with Senator Susan Collins, the Anti-Spoofing Penalties Modernization Act. Our bill doubles the existing penalties for individuals who provide misleading or inaccurate caller identification information. I frequently hear from my constituents in Arizona who've been defrauded or who are just annoyed by unsolicited calls and robocalls. And they're particularly troubling when they're spoofed to look like they're coming from a neighbor or a local business. Do you support our legislation, and how will it complement other FCC efforts to address the issue of scam callers?
Yes, robocalls are incredibly annoying, and among the most annoying are the ones that are spoofed to look like their family and friend who's calling you, so you're compelled to pick up the phone and answer. Those scams are increasing, and I appreciate the legislation that you have brought to this committee, which will increase the fines. That's terrific. It will help us as we proceed with enforcement activity, but as you mentioned, there are other things we're doing to cut down on spoofing. By requiring stir-shaken technology to be built into our IP networks, at the network level, we are engaged now in call authentication practices that should help cut down on this, this activity over time. But the mix of enforcement and technology might be the way that we're going to actually be able to tackle these troubling calls.
Thank you. Madam Chair, my time's expired. Thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Sinema. I'll now take my questions. I don't know if anybody else is going to join us, but I thank the witnesses. I know it's been a long morning